For 3 weeks, the skies over the Emberfall Valley had been wrong, not stormy or violent, but tense in a way that made even seasoned hunters glance upward with unease. The dragon broods that nested in the high cliffs beyond the farms were fiercely protective, and when their young vanished, the world felt it. Cattle refused to graze, birds scattered without warning, and distant roars rolled across the hills at night like thunder with teeth. Villages whispered of burned fields and coming judgment, certain that Dragonfire would soon fall in punishment for some forgotten sin. Patrols were sent into the forests, knights and mages searching for signs of blood or theft, but they found nothing. No tracks, no scorch marks, no remains. The baby dragons had simply vanished. Far below the cliffs, in a place no one thought to search, lived a farmer named Tomas Hale, a man with soil-stained hands, a bad knee, and a life built on routine rather than heroism. His farm sat alone at the edge of the valley, closer to wild land than comfort, and every morning he woke before dawn to tend animals that depended on him without question. Tomas had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. He had felt the tension too, the way the air seemed heavier, the way his horses snorted nervously at shadows. But fear did not change chores, and crops did not care about legends. One cold morning, as frost clung to the wooden beams of his old barn, Tomas noticed something strange. The goats refused to enter, stamping and bleating at the doorway, while the cows huddled close together, eyes fixed on the hayloft above. Tomas sighed, grabbed his lantern, and muttered about foxes or stray dogs, already annoyed at the thought of repairs. He climbed the ladder slowly, joints protesting, expecting noise or mess, but what he found instead stopped him cold. Curled together in the thick, dry hay were 6 baby dragons, no larger than sheepdogs, their scales muted and dusty, wings folded tight against their small bodies. They were asleep, deeply asleep, rising and falling in a slow, synchronized rhythm that spoke of safety rather than fear. Tomas stood frozen, lantern trembling in his grip, his mind struggling to reconcile stories of fire and death with the soft snuffling sounds drifting from the nest of hay. He should have run. Any sensible man would have. Dragons were not animals you startled, and hatchlings meant parents nearby, parents who would reduce his farm to ash without hesitation. But as Tomas watched, one of the hatchlings stirred, releasing a tiny puff of smoke that drifted harmlessly upward before fading. Another shifted closer to its siblings, pressing its head against a warm flank. They looked thin. Their scales lacked the healthy shine Tomas had seen from afar on adult dragons, and faint scratches marked their sides, as if they had squeezed through places too tight for comfort. Hunger, not malice, had brought them here. Tomas felt something settle in his chest, heavy and undeniable. These weren't invaders. They were lost. Slowly, carefully, Tomas set the lantern down and backed away without a sound, descending the ladder with the caution of a man who knew his next choices mattered more than his fear. He spent the rest of the morning in silence, moving through his chores like a ghost, mind racing. By nightfall, he had made a decision that would have earned him laughter or condemnation from anyone else in the valley. He returned to the barn with fresh water in shallow troughs, extra hay stacked thickly, and several sacks of grain mixed with dried meat he usually saved for winter emergencies. He placed everything within reach but did not touch the hatchlings, did not speak, did not try to claim them. He simply made space. Days passed. The dragons did not leave. They slept for long hours, waking only to eat and drink before retreating back into their hay nest, always together, always wary, yet never aggressive. Tomas adjusted his routine around them, keeping his distance, warning no one. Even when distant roars shook the valley and smoke rose far away as adult dragons searched in widening circles. At night, Tomas lay awake, listening to the barn settle, heart pounding every time wings rustled softly above him, knowing that if the truth came out, he would be blamed for whatever followed. But he could not bring himself to drive them away. He had raised orphan lambs, broken horses, even wounded wolves once caught in his traps, and the same rule had always applied. If something sought shelter rather than dominance, you answered with care. On the 22nd night, The ground trembled so violently that dust fell from the rafters, and Tomas knew the search had reached its end. He stepped out into the cold, standing between his farmhouse and the barn, armed with nothing but a lantern and a resolve he did not fully understand. Above him, massive shadows descended, blotting out the stars as enraged adult dragons circled, their roars shaking the valley awake. Tomas did not run. He did not hide. He simply waited, knowing that when the truth came it would burn or save him. But either way, he had already chosen what kind of man he was going to be. The valley did not sleep that night, because fear has a way of traveling faster than sound when dragons are involved. And by the time Tomas stood alone before his barn, the air itself felt sharpened, stretched thin by the presence of something ancient and furious descending from the sky. The first dragon landed at the edge of the fields with a force that flattened grass and split frozen earth, its massive wings folding like storm clouds pulled into shape, followed by another, and then another, until the farm was surrounded by living legends whose names had once burned cities into history. Their scales glowed with restrained fire, eyes blazing with panic barely contained by discipline, and Tomas felt the weight of their attention crash into him like a wall. He was a farmer, not a soldier, not a mage, not a man meant to stand before creatures who could end his life between heartbeats. Yet his feet stayed planted in the dirt he had worked his whole life. One dragon lowered its head, smoke curling from its nostrils, and demanded to know where the hatchlings were, its voice vibrating through Tomas's chest so violently he tasted blood. Tomas swallowed hard, lifting the lantern slightly so they could see his hands were empty, his posture open, and he answered with the only truth he had. They were safe, they were alive, and they were asleep in his barn. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several dragons reared back, wings spreading wide, fire flaring instinctively as the idea of their young so close to a human structure collided with centuries of fear and instinct. Tomas flinched but did not retreat, raising his voice, not in defiance but urgency, telling them they were thin, exhausted, and had come on their own, telling them he had not trapped them, harmed them, or even touched them. As if summoned by the rising tension, a faint, high-pitched chirping sound drifted from the barn loft, followed by the soft rustle of hay and the unmistakable flutter of small wings. The sound sliced through the standoff like a blade. Every adult dragon froze, heads snapping toward the barn as 6 small shapes peeked over the edge of the hayloft, eyes glowing softly in the lantern light. The hatchlings did not cry in fear. They chirped in recognition, bodies wiggling excitedly, as they spotted the familiar humans standing below. Tomas felt his heart drop into his boots as one of the smallest hatchlings attempted an awkward glide downward, landing in the hay with a clumsy tumble before scrambling toward him with uncoordinated enthusiasm. Gasps, actual gasps, rippled through the ring of adult dragons as the hatchling reached Tomas and pressed its small head against his leg, humming contentedly. Tomas stood perfectly still, afraid that even breathing might shatter the moment, while the adult dragons watched in stunned silence as the others followed, hopping and gliding down to cluster around the human's boots, clearly unafraid. The largest dragon stepped forward then, her presence immediately commanding the others into stillness, her scales darker, older, etched with scars that spoke of centuries of survival. She studied the scene with eyes that missed nothing. The full troughs, the clean straw, the absence of chains or cages, the relaxed posture of hatchlings who had known hunger and fear and now knew neither. Tomas felt those eyes turn on him, weighing his soul with terrifying precision. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than the others but infinitely more dangerous. She asked why he had not alerted the valley, why he had not driven the hatchlings away, why he had chosen silence over safety. Tomas answered slowly, choosing honesty over cleverness, saying that he knew how the valley would react, that soldiers and mages would have turned fear into violence before understanding ever had a chance, and that the hatchlings had not needed judgment, they had needed rest. The dragon matriarch lowered her head slightly, eyes narrowing, and asked if he understood the risk he had taken, not just to himself but to every human in the valley. Tomas nodded, his voice rough as he said that farmers lived by risk, that every seed planted was a gamble against weather and rot, and that some things were worth protecting even if they could destroy you. Silence fell again, heavier this time, As the matriarch turned her gaze to the hatchlings climbing over Tomas like curious calves, tugging gently at his coat and boots, she let out a slow, controlled breath, firelight flickering deep in her chest. And when she spoke again, it was not to threaten but to declare that the search was over. She ordered the other dragons to stand down, their wings folding reluctantly as tension bled from the air, and then she did something no one in the valley would ever believe without seeing it themselves. She bowed her massive head slightly toward a human farmer. Tomas did not understand the gesture, but he felt its weight settle into history. The matriarch said that the hatchlings had wandered farther than intended during their first flights and had been caught by exhaustion and hunger, that Tomas's barn had become their refuge by choice, and that dragon law recognized choice as sacred. She warned him that the world was dangerous for creatures so young, that their parents' fear had nearly turned into catastrophe, and that his silence had prevented bloodshed. As the hatchlings were gently herded back toward their waiting kin, each one paused, nuzzling Tomas in farewell, their small wings brushing his arms and shoulders, leaving warmth behind. When the last dragon took to the sky and the valley finally exhaled, Tomas was left standing in trampled grass beneath a clearing sky, his barn intact, his heart pounding, and the quiet realization that he had just done something no hero had managed in centuries. Not by strength, not by magic, but by treating lost dragons the same way he treated any frightened creature that wandered onto his land. Morning came to Emberfall Valley like an apology, soft sunlight spilling over the hills as if the world itself was trying to pretend that the night before had not nearly rewritten history. Tomas rose before dawn out of habit, his body aching in familiar ways, and for a few quiet seconds he almost convinced himself that the dragons had been a dream brought on by exhaustion and fear. Then he stepped outside and saw the crushed earth, the scorched grass, and the deep claw marks pressed into frozen soil around his fields, and reality settled in with a weight that made him sit down on the porch steps and breathe. Word did not spread immediately, but it never stays silent for long when something impossible happens, and by mid-morning riders began appearing at the edge of his land, villagers and guards alike drawn by rumors that twisted and grew with every mile traveled. Tomas watched them gather from a distance, their hands never far from weapons, their eyes darting to the sky as if expecting fire to rain down at any moment. He did not blame them. Dragons were fear made flesh to most people, and fear demanded someone to blame. When the first guards approached, they questioned him sharply, demanding to know why dragons had descended on his farm, why he had not raised the alarm, and whether he had made some kind of bargain that endangered the valley. Tomas answered each question plainly, repeating the truth until his voice grew hoarse, and though some scoffed, others listened, unsettled by the consistency of his story and the lack of fear in his posture. The turning point came when the air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, and shadows crossed the fields as familiar massive shapes descended from the clouds. Not in rage this time, but in controlled, deliberate formation. Panic rippled through the gathered crowd as dragons landed beyond the fences, their sheer presence enough to send several men to their knees, but Tomas did not move. The dragon matriarch emerged, her gaze sweeping over humans with ancient patience, and declared in a voice that carried without effort that Tomas Hale was under dragon protection. The words hit the valley harder than any roar, freezing every whispered accusation mid-breath. She spoke of the hatchlings, of hunger and refuge, of choice freely given and freely honored, and she made it clear that any harm brought to the farmer or his land would be answered as an act of aggression against dragonkind itself. Fear shifted shape in that moment, transforming into awe and confusion, and Tomas felt the strange disorientation of becoming something he had never sought to be, a point of balance between two worlds that had never trusted each other. Over the following days, the dragons returned often, not in numbers that threatened but in ones that observed, watched, and learned. Hatchlings were brought under careful supervision, allowed to wander the fields and barn under Tomas's watchful eye, their parents hovering nearby with restrained anxiety. Tomas treated them no differently than before, correcting them gently when they singed fence posts or frightened livestock, rewarding calm behavior with food and quiet words, and the dragons watched in fascination as their young responded not to dominance but consistency. The valley watched too, slowly, cautiously, as fear gave way to curiosity, then reluctant acceptance. Children were the first to approach, always the first to sense safety before logic could interfere. And Tomas found himself mediating encounters between wide-eyed villagers and creatures they had only known through fireside horror stories. He never claimed credit, never spoke of bravery, insisting only that kindness had been easier than cruelty in the moment that mattered. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the dragon matriarch returned alone, her massive form casting a long shadow over the fields. She told Tomas that dragon memory was long, that acts like his did not fade with time, and that the balance between dragons and humans had shifted in ways neither side fully understood yet. She warned him that his life would no longer be small or quiet, no matter how much he wished it otherwise, because the world paid attention when someone proved that fear was not the only language worth speaking. Tomas listened in silence, staring out over his land where hatchlings dozed in the grass like oversized cats, and when she asked if he regretted his choice, he answered without hesitation that he would do it again, every time. The matriarch studied him for a long moment, then inclined her head in acknowledgement, leaving him with the weight of a future that no longer belonged solely to him. As night fell, Tomas walked his fields, lantern in hand, the sounds of both human and dragon life blending into something new and fragile, and he understood that the valley would never return to what it had been. But perhaps, for the first time, it had the chance to become something better. The years that followed did not unfold with the drama bards would later insist upon, but with the slow, stubborn rhythm of real change, the kind that takes root quietly and reshapes the world before anyone realizes it has already happened. Tomas's farm became a place spoken of in lowered voices at first, then with growing confidence, until travelers deliberately altered their routes just to see the land where dragons slept without chains and humans walked without fear. The dragon matriarch kept her word, and no harm came to Tomas or his fields. Storms bent away from his land, predators avoided his fences, and more than once a shadow passed overhead at night, silent and watchful, a reminder of the protection he had never asked for. Hatchlings grew, returning often in their early years, not because they were commanded to, but because memory drew them back to the place where hunger had ended and trust had begun. They learned restraint in his fields, learned the meaning of boundaries without cruelty, and in turn taught their parents something equally dangerous and powerful, that humans were not defined solely by fear or greed. Slowly, trade replaced tension as dragon scales shed naturally were exchanged for tools and grain, and ancient knowledge flowed back into human hands in return, not as tribute but as cooperation. Tomas never styled himself a mediator or a legend. He continued to rise before dawn, to mend fences, to curse bad weather, and to care for creatures that wandered into his life needing help. Yet children grew up knowing his name, not as a hero of war, but as proof that gentleness could stand before fire and remain unburned. When Tomas grew older and his hands shook too much for heavy labor, the dragons noticed before anyone else did. On his final winter, the valley was blanketed in snow so deep it should have starved the land, but warmth lingered around his farmhouse, gentle and controlled, warding off the cold without burning a single beam. The dragon matriarch came one last time, her scales dulled by age yet her presence still vast, and she sat beside his home like a mountain choosing to rest. Tomas spoke little then, his strength fading, but when he passed, it was said that the sky itself mourned, clouds parting to reveal stars brighter than any seen before. Dragons circled silently above as humans stood below, not in terror, but in shared grief, and in that moment something ancient and broken finally healed. Long after Tomas Hale was laid to rest beneath the soil he loved, the valley remembered him not for defying dragons, but for welcoming the lost without asking what it might cost him. And in dragon lore, passed from brood to brood for centuries, his name endured as a quiet warning and a promise that the smallest acts of kindness, offered without expectation, could change the course of fire and fate alike. Long after Tomas Hale's name had settled into legend and soil alike, the changes he set in motion continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted, because history rarely moves in straight lines once fear loosens its grip. A generation grew up in Emberfall Valley having seen dragons not as omens of ruin but as neighbors of the sky, and that alone reshaped the spine of human thinking more thoroughly than any treaty ever had. Children learned early which shadows meant danger and which meant protection, how to read the language of wings and posture, how to stand calmly rather than run screaming when something vast passed overhead. Farmers built barns with reinforced lofts not as defenses but as shelters, and travelers learned that a lantern left burning in an open field was no longer a sign of weakness, but an invitation for aid should any creature, human or otherwise, need it. Dragons, for their part, changed more slowly, but change they did, because memory was their greatest strength and their greatest burden. Hatchlings raised on stories of Tomas did not ask why a human would help them. They asked how they could be worthy of such trust in return. When conflicts flared elsewhere between humans and dragonkind, emissaries were sent not with threats, but with stories of a farmer who fed the lost, who stood unarmed between fire and fear, who proved that restraint was not submission. Some elders scoffed, others listened. But even skepticism could not erase the fact that Emberfall Valley remained untouched by war, generation after generation. Its skies watched over without domination. Centuries later, when scholars attempted to trace the true beginning of the long peace, they found no grand battle to mark the turning point, no decisive spell or slain tyrant, only records of an ordinary man whose response to the extraordinary had been compassion rather than panic. Dragons still breathed fire, still defended their own with terrifying ferocity, but they no longer assumed that destruction was the only language humans understood. And humans, remembering Tomas, learned that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it simply opened a door, laid out food, and trusted that kindness might survive the night. Even now, when a young dragon grows weary on its first long flight and senses warmth below, it may drift downward toward the quiet glow of a farmhouse lantern, guided not by instinct alone, but by a story older than fear. A story that says there was once a human who smiled at the lost, and the world was never the same again.